The afternoon of June 24, 1947, began as a routine flight for Kenneth Arnold, a skilled pilot and fire control equipment salesman. While flying his Call Air A-2 near Mount Rainier in Washington state, Arnold was diverted by a sudden flash of light, a reflection so bright it felt like a mirror hitting his eyes. Looking toward the horizon, he expected to see a neighboring aircraft. Instead, he witnessed a chain of 9 peculiar objects weaving through the mountain peaks with unbelievable speed. Arnold watched, mesmerized and disturbed, as the objects skipped across the atmosphere like stones across a pond. He estimated their speed at roughly 1,200 miles per hour, a velocity nearly double that of any known jet in the post-WWII era. When he landed, Arnold didn't intend to become the face of a paranormal revolution. He simply reported what he saw to the Civil Aeronautics Administration. However, his description of their movement, like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water, was seized upon by the press. By the next morning, the term flying saucer was splashed across every major newspaper in America. The timing was a tinderbox for the American psyche. The United States had just emerged from the horrors of World War II, only to find itself locked in the icy grip of the Cold War. The atomic age had arrived, and with it, a newfound sense of vulnerability. If these objects weren't ours, were they Soviet? Or were they something even more foreign? Within weeks of Arnold's report, hundreds of similar sightings flooded in from across the country, including the legendary and later retracted crash report in Roswell, New Mexico. This wasn't just a series of sightings, it was the birth of a national obsession. The sky, once a symbol of American aerial dominance, had suddenly become a source of profound mystery and potential threat. People began looking upward with a mixture of wonder and dread. The Arnold sighting acted as the Big Bang for modern ufology, forcing the U.S. Army Air Forces to take notice. They could no longer dismiss these reports as mass hysteria or sunspots. The government needed a way to categorize, investigate, and most importantly, quiet the growing public alarm. The Summer of the Saucers effectively ended the era of innocence in American aviation, setting the stage for the secret corridors of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the eventual formation of Project Blue Book. The mystery of the unknowns had officially begun, and for the American public, the world would never look the same again. As the echoes of the Summer of the Saucers faded, a chilling realization settled over the Pentagon. The wonder of the unknown was quickly replaced by the cold, hard logic of national security. In the late 1940s, the United States was no longer just curious about the lights in the sky. It was terrified. The military establishment viewed the phenomenon through a single, narrow lens: Cold War paranoia. To the generals in Washington, the idea of little green men was a fantasy for pulp magazines. However, the idea of Soviet technological breakthroughs was a nightmare that kept them awake at night. The U.S. had ended World War II as the world's sole nuclear power, but that monopoly was fragile. Intelligence reports suggested that the USSR had captured elite Nazi scientists and advanced aeronautical designs, specifically the Flying Wing and circular Horton Brothers prototypes. If the Soviets had perfected these designs, the unknowns buzzing American airspace weren't visitors from Mars. They were long-range reconnaissance craft from Moscow. This fear was rooted in a desperate need to maintain technological superiority. The Pentagon worried that if the Soviets possessed aircraft capable of the hypersonic speeds and erratic maneuvers reported by pilots like Kenneth Arnold, the entire U.S. air defense system was obsolete. There was a haunting possibility that the saucers were a psychological warfare tool designed to expose gaps in American radar or to clog communication channels with false reports, leaving the country vulnerable to a surprise nuclear strike. By 1948, this tension led to the creation of Project Sign. Within the high-security vaults of the Air Materiel Command, analysts scrutinized every report for signs of red engineering. They looked for exhaust trails, the hum of unconventional engines, and patterns that suggested strategic mapping of American military bases. The unknowns were treated as high-stakes intelligence puzzles. Every blurry photograph was magnified to see if it bore the insignia of the hammer and sickle. However, the paranoia cut both ways. If the U.S. military admitted they couldn't identify these objects, they were admitting a lapse in the defense of American soil. This created a culture of secrecy and debunking. To prevent mass panic and to keep the Soviets from knowing what the U.S. did or did not see, the Air Force began a campaign to explain away sightings as weather balloons, meteors, or temperature inversions. Yet behind closed doors, the anxiety persisted. The Pentagon wasn't just searching for UFOs. They were searching for a Sputnik before it ever reached orbit. They feared that the high ground of the sky had been stolen by an adversary. This era of suspicion transformed the UFO phenomenon from a series of strange sightings into a matter of existential survival, ensuring that the study of the skies would remain a classified, military-controlled secret for decades to come. Before the polished investigations of Project Blue Book became a household name, the U.S. Air Force struggled through a period of internal civil war regarding the UFO phenomenon. This era was defined by two short-lived but pivotal programs, Project Sign and Project Grudge. These were the chaotic predecessors that set the stage for decades of government secrecy and public skepticism. Project Sign, established in late 1947 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, began with a surprising degree of open-mindedness. The team, comprised of elite engineers and intelligence officers, didn't start with the assumption that witnesses were crazy. In fact, many of the initial investigators were deeply unsettled by the data. This peaked in 1948 with the Chili's-Whitted case, where two commercial pilots reported a cigar-shaped craft with glowing windows that nearly collided with their plane. The Sign investigators were so impressed by the evidence that they produced a document known as the Estimate of the Situation. Their conclusion was explosive. UFOs were likely interplanetary in origin. However, when this report reached the desk of Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, it was met with a cold, bureaucratic wall. Vandenberg rejected the report for a lack of physical proof, ordered the document burned, and demanded a shift in tone. Almost overnight, the mission changed from objective science to aggressive debunking. By 1949, Project Sign was dismantled and replaced by the cynical Project Grudge. If Sign was an investigation, Grudge was a public relations campaign. The mandate was clear: explain away every sighting, no matter how credible, to reduce public hysteria. The Air Force feared that if the public became too obsessed with UFOs, the Soviets could use the confusion to mask an actual airstrike. Under Project Grudge, the standard of evidence became a mockery. Pilots who reported metallic discs were told they had seen sun dogs or unusually bright stars. Even the most high-quality reports were filed away under the label psychological manifestation. This heavy-handed approach backfired, leading to a culture of ridicule that silenced many military personnel who feared for their careers. However, it also sparked a growing distrust between the American public and the Pentagon, a gap that would never truly close. By the end of 1949, Project Grudge issued its final report, claiming that UFOs were not a threat and did not represent advanced technology. But the sightings didn't stop. The ghost rockets and silver spheres continued to haunt American skies, proving that a PR campaign could not wish away a physical mystery. The failure of Grudge to provide satisfying answers eventually forced the military to create a more organized, long-term program. From the ashes of these two chaotic projects, Project Blue Book was born, bringing with it a new leader and a more scientific approach to the search for the truth. By late 1951, the Air Force's handling of unidentified aerial phenomena was a disaster. Project Grudge had become a laughingstock of low-effort debunking, and the public's trust in the military was at an all-time low. Out of this bureaucratic wreckage emerged Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, a decorated World War II bombardier with a background in aeronautical engineering. He was appointed to lead the newly reorganized effort, officially designated as Project Blue Book. Ruppelt was not a saucer hunter or a conspiracy theorist. He was an organizer. He realized that the first step to solving a mystery was to speak about it with scientific precision. At the time, the media was obsessed with flying saucers, a term Ruppelt found derogatory and misleading. He felt it prejudged the shape and nature of the objects. To bring a sense of professionalism to the field, he coined the term unidentified flying object, UFO. With that single stroke of a pen, he transformed a tabloid sensation into a legitimate military and scientific category. Ruppelt's tenure at Blue Book, 1951-1953, is often referred to as the program's Golden Age. He treated the investigation like a serious intelligence operation rather than a public relations problem. He drafted the standard operating procedure for reporting sightings, ensuring that every Air Force base in the world followed a uniform questionnaire. He brought in experts from diverse fields, including astronomers, physicists, and psychologists. Most notably, he recruited Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer who would eventually become the world's leading authority on the subject. Under Ruppelt's leadership, the project actually tried to investigate. He categorized sightings based on reliability and physical evidence, creating a database that allowed the military to spot trends and geographical flaps. He was the first to take radar visual sightings seriously. Cases where a pilot saw an object at the same moment, a radar operator on the ground tracked a physical target moving at impossible speeds. However, Ruppelt's desire for transparency often put him at odds with the Pentagon's higher-ups. While he was trying to collect data, the military's top brass was still reeling from the 1952 Washington, D.C. flap, where UFOs seemingly invaded the restricted airspace over the White House. The pressure to simplify and dismiss these cases became unbearable. Despite the eventual return to secrecy after his departure, Ruppelt's legacy is undeniable. He took a chaotic collection of campfire stories and turned them into a structured archive of human experience. He didn't claim to have found extraterrestrials, but he proved that there was something truly unknown in the skies that demanded serious attention. When he finally left the project and wrote his seminal book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, he left behind the blueprint for how we talk about the mystery to this day. In the long history of Project Blue Book, no event shook the American establishment quite like the Washington, D.C. flap of July 1952. For 2 consecutive weekends, the very heart of American power, the restricted airspace above the White House and the U.S. Capitol was breached by unknowns that moved with a physics-defying grace. This wasn't a blurry photo from a lonely farmer. This was a multi-sensor, multi-witness event that brought the Cold War's secret fears into the neon lights of the Capitol. The crisis began just before midnight on July 19, when air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport noticed 7 pips on their radar screens. These were not scheduled flights. The objects were moving slowly at first, but then suddenly accelerated to speeds exceeding 7,000 miles per hour, performing sharp 90-degree turns that would have crushed any human pilot under the G-force. Simultaneously, pilots in the area reported seeing bright orange discs and glittering lights that danced around their cockpits, only to vanish when the planes tried to give chase. By the second weekend, July 26, the situation escalated into a national security emergency. As the objects reappeared on radar, the Air Force scrambled F-94 Starfighter jet interceptors. A surreal cat-and-mouse game ensued over the Potomac River. As soon as the jets approached, the lights would blink out or streak away at impossible velocities. When the jets returned to base to refuel, the lights would reappear over the Capitol. The message seemed clear. Whatever was in the sky had complete control of the engagement. The public reaction was a mixture of awe and sheer panic. Headline news across the globe screamed, "Saucers swarm over Capitol." For a nation already paranoid about a Soviet nuclear strike, the sight of unidentified craft hovering over the seat of government suggested that the United States was utterly defenseless. President Harry S. Truman himself called Captain Edward Ruppelt at Project Blue Book, demanding answers. The Pentagon was in a state of chaos, unable to explain how foreign objects, whether from Moscow or another world, could operate with such impunity over the most protected city on Earth. To quell the rising hysteria, the Air Force held the largest press conference since World War II. Major General John Samford told a room packed with reporters that the radar blips were likely temperature inversions, a weather phenomenon where layers of warm air reflect radar signals from the ground. It was a classic Blue Book explanation, scientifically plausible in theory, but completely dismissed by the radar operators and pilots who were actually there. The 1952 flap changed everything. It proved that UFOs were not just a fringe curiosity. They were a phenomenon that could challenge the military's command of the air. This event directly led to the CIA's involvement and the eventual debunking mandate of the Robertson panel. The lights over the White House faded, but the sense of security they shattered would never be fully restored. The aftermath of the 1952 Washington, D.C. flap left the American intelligence community in a state of high alert. While the public wondered about visitors from other worlds, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was focused on a much more grounded fear: the collapse of organized society. In January 1953, the CIA convened a secret group of eminent scientists led by Dr. Howard P. Robertson. a world-renowned physicist from Caltech. This group, known as the Robertson Panel, would fundamentally change the American government's approach to UFOs, shifting from genuine investigation to a strategy of psychological management. For 4 days, the panel reviewed the most unexplainable cases from Project Blue Book. They looked at films, radar data, and pilot testimonies. However, the panel's conclusion was not based on whether UFOs were real in a physical sense, but rather on what the idea of UFOs was doing to the American people. They determined that UFOs did not pose a direct physical threat to national security, meaning they weren't Soviet bombers, but they did pose a catastrophic threat to public order. The CIA's logic was chillingly pragmatic. During the Cold War, the U.S. relied on its early warning radar systems to detect an incoming Soviet nuclear strike. The Robertson Panel feared that if the public continued to report thousands of unknowns, the military's communication channels would become clogged. In the event of a real Russian attack, the vital warning signs might be lost in a sea of saucer reports. Furthermore, they worried that UFO hysteria could be exploited by Soviet agents to spark mass panic, causing a breakdown in the American social fabric. To combat this, the Robertson Panel recommended a policy of national debunking. They suggested that the government use the mass media, including Disney and other film studios, to strip the UFO phenomenon of its aura of mystery. The goal was to make the subject so ridiculous that no credible person would want to report a sighting for fear of being laughed at. They effectively ordered Project Blue Book to stop being a research project and start being a public relations shield. This policy gave birth to the official skepticism that defined the next 2 decades. Scientific inquiry was replaced by psychological warfare against the American public's own curiosity. The panel even suggested monitoring civilian UFO research groups, viewing them as potential sources of subversion. The Robertson Panel succeeded in its mission. UFOs became a joke in the eyes of the serious scientific establishment. But this success came at a heavy price. By prioritizing public order over the truth, the CIA sowed the seeds of a deep-seated conspiracy culture. For many Americans, the panel's secret conclusions were the first evidence that the government wasn't just unable to explain the lights in the sky, it was actively trying to hide what it knew. Nestled on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, WPAFB, stands as a sprawling monument to American aviation history. To the average citizen, it is the home of the Air Force Materiel Command. But in the mid-20th century, to those who looked at the stars with suspicion, it was something far more mysterious: the Area 51 of its day. This was the nerve center for Project Blue Book, the place where the most classified, unsettling secrets of the Cold War skies were funneled, analyzed, and ultimately locked away. The choice of Wright-Patterson was no accident. As the headquarters of the Foreign Technology Division, FTD, the base was already the military's premier site for reverse engineering captured enemy equipment. If a Soviet MiG was recovered in Korea, it was sent to Wright-Patterson to be torn apart and studied. It was only logical that if a flying disc were ever recovered, or if a pilot encountered a craft that defied the laws of physics, the data would end up here. The base became the physical intersection of Cold War intelligence and the extraterrestrial mystery. Inside the secure corridors of Building 262, a small team of officers and civilians worked in a high-stakes environment. The atmosphere was one of quiet, bureaucratic intensity. Steel filing cabinets were overflowing with thousands of Form 112 reports, standardized documents containing sketches of metallic orbs, glowing cigars, and rapid-moving lights. These were the Blue Book files, a growing archive of human encounters with the unexplained. However, the reality of Wright-Patterson was often a far cry from the high-tech laboratories depicted in science fiction. For most of its existence, Project Blue Book was chronically underfunded and understaffed. While the public imagined a massive underground complex filled with alien wreckage, giving rise to the legendary Hangar 18 myths, the actual Blue Book office was often just a few desks manned by a handful of people. Yet the secrecy surrounding the base fueled the fire of public imagination. The fact that the military refused to share the contents of those cabinets suggested that the foreign technology they were studying might not be from any country on a map. The base also served as the primary meeting ground for the project's most famous duo, the pragmatic Captain Edward Ruppelt and the intellectual Dr. J. Allen Hynek. It was here, among the roar of experimental jet engines on the nearby runways, that they debated the nature of reality. They sifted through physical trace cases, soil samples from alleged landing sites, or pieces of magnesium purportedly dropped from the sky. To this day, Wright-Patterson remains the mecca of UFO lore. Long after Blue Book was shuttered in 1969, the base continues to be a focal point for researchers convinced that the most significant evidence of the 20th century still sits in a vault beneath the Ohio soil. It remains a place where the line between national security and the greatest mystery in human history is permanently blurred. In the early years of Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force needed a man of unimpeachable scientific standing to give their investigations an air of legitimacy. They found that man in Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a brilliant astrophysicist and professor at Ohio State University. When he was first hired as a consultant in 1948, Hynek was the ultimate skeptic. He viewed the UFO phenomenon as a fad born of post-war nerves and astronomical ignorance. To the Air Force, he was the perfect debunker, the man who would provide a rational, scientific explanation for the saucers and put the public's mind at ease. Hynek took his job seriously. Armed with a pipe and a sharp analytical mind, he spent years dismissing hundreds of sightings as misidentified stars, planets, or weather phenomena. He was the one who famously told the public that people weren't seeing spaceships. They were simply looking at Mars, Venus, or bright meteors. At this stage of his career, Hynek was a loyal soldier in the Robertson panel's war on hysteria. He believed that once the science was explained, the mystery would evaporate. However, as the years rolled by, a quiet transformation began to take place within the halls of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Hynek wasn't just reading reports, he was interviewing witnesses. He met with decorated pilots, sober-minded police officers, and technical experts whose testimonies didn't fit the ignorant observer mold. He began to notice a disturbing trend. A small, stubborn percentage of cases, the unknowns, simply could not be explained away by any known natural or man-made cause. These witnesses were often deeply traumatized by what they saw, and their descriptions of the object's physics-defying maneuvers were remarkably consistent. The turning point for Hynek's soul came in the mid-1960s. He grew increasingly frustrated with the Air Force's demand for quick and easy explanations. He felt he was being forced to compromise his scientific integrity to satisfy a political agenda. The bridge finally broke during the infamous 1966 Michigan sightings, where Hynek, under immense pressure from the Pentagon, suggested that a group of credible witnesses had actually seen swamp gas. The national outcry and ridicule that followed this explanation mortified him. Hynek realized that by ridiculing the witnesses, the scientific community was ignoring potentially the greatest discovery in human history. He stopped being a paid skeptic and started being a true investigator. He eventually broke away from the Air Force's shadow and founded the Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS. He even developed the Close Encounters scale, first, second, and third kind, which would later inspire Steven Spielberg. By the time Project Blue Book closed, the man hired to kill the mystery had become its most sophisticated advocate, warning the world that, when the long-awaited solution to the UFO problem comes, I believe that it will prove to be not merely the next step in the sequence of science, but a mighty and totally unexpected quantum leap. By March 1966, the American public's patience with the Air Force's dismissive attitude toward UFOs was wearing thin. The tension finally snapped in Dexter and Hillsdale, Michigan, during a week-long wave of sightings that would go down in history as one of the most embarrassing chapters for Project Blue Book. It was an event that didn't just feature glowing lights. It involved over 100 witnesses, including dozens of police officers and a group of college students, all of whom saw something they couldn't explain. The sightings began on the night of March 20, when a local farmer and his son reported a large, glowing object landing in a nearby swampy area. They described it as having a coral-like surface with pulsating red and green lights. The following night at Hillsdale College, dozens of students and a civil defense director watched a glowing, football-shaped object hover over a swamp for several hours. Unlike many fleeting sightings, these were prolonged encounters. The witnesses weren't looking at distant stars. They were looking at physical craft operating at low altitudes. Under intense media pressure, the Air Force dispatched their top scientific consultant, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, to Michigan. Hynek arrived to a scene of near hysteria. Reporters were everywhere. and the local population was demanding an answer. After a hurried investigation and a brief look at the marshy terrain, Hynek was pressured by the Pentagon to hold a press conference and provide a definitive explanation to quiet the national saucer fever. On March 25, 1966, in a crowded room at the Detroit Press Club, Hynek delivered the words that would haunt his career. Swamp gas. He suggested that the witnesses had seen marsh gas, methane produced by decaying vegetation, which had ignited spontaneously and created a faint, glowing light. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The witnesses felt insulted. The Michigan police officers, who had chased the lights for miles, were outraged at the suggestion that they couldn't tell the difference between a physical craft and a flickering bog light. Gerald Ford, then a congressman from Michigan and future U.S. president, was so incensed by the Air Force's flimsy explanation that he called for a formal congressional hearing into the UFO phenomenon. He famously stated, "The American people are entitled to a more thorough explanation than has been given them by the Air Force." The swamp gas incident was a turning point. It turned the UFO mystery into a political issue and shifted public opinion from curiosity to suspicion. It became clear that Project Blue Book was no longer an objective scientific study, but a tool for social control. For the first time, the scientific skeptic himself, Dr. Hynek, felt the sting of public ridicule, a humiliation that ultimately pushed him to stop defending the Air Force and start seeking the genuine, unvarnished truth. The gas may have been in the swamp, but the fire of skepticism was now burning in the hearts of the American people. By the late 1960s, the Air Force was desperate to get out of the UFO business. The political fallout from the swamp gas incident and the constant pressure from Congress had made Project Blue Book a public relations nightmare. To settle the matter once and for all, the government decided to hand the mystery over to a prestigious academic institution. In 1966, they commissioned the University of Colorado, under the leadership of renowned physicist Dr. Edward Kundin, to conduct an independent scientific study of the phenomenon. This became known as the Kundin Committee. On the surface, it appeared to be the objective, high-level inquiry that the public had been demanding for decades. However, behind the scenes, the committee was mired in controversy from its inception. Unlike Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who had grown to respect the data, Dr. Kundin was openly dismissive of the subject. Even before the study was completed, Kundin was quoted in newspapers saying that UFOs were nonsense and that he wouldn't recommend that the government spend another cent on them. The internal friction reached a boiling point when a staff member discovered a secret memo written by the project's coordinator, Robert Lowe. The infamous Lowe memo suggested that the study should be designed to appear objective to the public, while the staff actually intended to prove that there was no scientific basis for UFOs. This discovery led to a mutiny. Several investigators were fired for incompetence after they questioned the committee's bias, sparking a scandal that even reached the pages of Look magazine. Despite the internal turmoil, the committee released its massive 1485-page final report, the Kundin Report, in 1968. The report's executive summary, written by Kundin himself, was a death blow to ufology. It stated that nothing of scientific value had come from the study of UFOs and that further investigation was not justified. The irony of the Kundin Report was hidden in its fine print. While the summary dismissed the phenomenon, the actual case studies within the report were far more ambiguous. Of the 59 cases analyzed, roughly one-third remained unidentified. One famous case involving a 1956 radar visual sighting at Lakenheath, England, was described by the committee's own researchers as puzzling and the most amazing and intelligent maneuvers they had ever seen. The Air Force, however, ignored the internal contradictions. They had what they wanted: a scientific excuse to close the doors. In 1969, based on the Kundin Committee's recommendations, the Secretary of the Air Force announced the termination of Project Blue Book. The book was officially shut, but for many, the Kundin Committee remained the ultimate symbol of a government cover-up. A study designed not to find the truth, but to bury it under a mountain of academic jargon. When Project Blue Book officially closed its doors in 1969, the final tally was staggering. Of the 12,618 sightings reported to the U.S. Air Force over 2 decades, the vast majority were dismissed as misidentified stars, balloons, or aircraft. However, after all the debunking, the swamp gas theories, and the bureaucratic scrubbing, a stubborn residue remained. These were the 701 unidentifieds, cases that lacked any conventional explanation and continue to haunt the annals of American military history. These 701 files were not the sightings of cranks or the over-imaginative. Many were documented by the most reliable witnesses the Cold War could produce. Veteran combat pilots, radar technicians, and nuclear scientists. These cases were defined by what researchers call high strangeness. The objects involved didn't just fly. They defied the known laws of Newtonian physics, executing instant stops from supersonic speeds and vanishing from radar only to reappear miles away in a heartbeat. One of the most chilling cases within the 701 occurred in 1957 over the southern United States. An Air Force RB-47, a sophisticated electronic intelligence aircraft, was followed for over 800 miles by a glowing object. This wasn't just a visual sighting. The object was tracked by the plane's onboard radar, ground-based radar, and the crew's electronic countermeasures, ECM equipment. The object blinked on and off, changed colors, and circled the high-speed jet with effortless ease. Despite the mountain of electronic data, Project Blue Book eventually labeled it unidentified, admitting they had no earthly answer for what had stalked a nuclear-capable bomber. Another case involved the 1953 Ellsworth Air Force Base incident, where a glowing red light was chased by an F-84 fighter jet. Both the pilot and ground radar operators watched as the object maintained a perfect lead on the jet before suddenly accelerating at a speed calculated at over 5,000 miles per hour. When the Air Force tried to apply their standard explanations, whether inversions or astronomical bodies, the data simply broke the theory. For the analysts at Wright-Patterson, these 701 cases were the glitch in the matrix. They represented a technology that was not American, not Soviet, and seemingly not of this world. While the Air Force's public stance was that UFOs were no threat, the internal 701 files told a different story. One of a persistent, intelligent presence in American airspace that could outmaneuver the finest technology of the era. The unidentified 701 remain the holy grail for modern researchers. They serve as a permanent reminder that even with the full weight of the U.S. military's scientific resources, a core mystery remained unsolved. When the files were finally declassified and moved to the National Archives, these 701 cases became the foundation for the modern UAP unidentified aerial phenomena movement, proving that the search for the truth didn't end with Blue Book. It was only just beginning. By the winter of December 1969, the Cold War was entering a new, more complex phase. The United States had successfully landed men on the moon, and the high-tech race for space seemed to have a clear winner. Against this backdrop of lunar triumph, the U.S. Air Force decided it was time to quietly bury its most controversial terrestrial mystery. On December 17, 1969, Secretary of the Air Force Robert C. Siemens Jr. issued a memorandum that officially terminated Project Blue Book. After 22 years of investigation, the military was walking away from the flying saucer. The decision was the final act of a long-planned retreat. The Air Force cited the findings of the Condon Committee as the primary justification, stating that the continuation of Project Blue Book could no longer be justified on the grounds of national security or scientific interest. The official press release was cold and clinical. It claimed that no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force had ever given any indication of being a threat to our national security, nor had there been evidence that sightings represented technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. With a stroke of a pen, the specialized office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base began the process of dissolution. The personnel were reassigned, the specialized equipment was mothballed, and the massive archive of 12,618 case files was prepared for transfer. The unknowns were no longer a military priority. To the Pentagon, the termination was a successful disposal of a public relations headache. To the public, however, it felt like a betrayal of the truth. The closing of the files marked a significant shift in the American landscape. It ended the era where a citizen could call their local Air Force base to report a strange light and expect a military investigator to show up with a Geiger counter and a notebook. By withdrawing from the field, the government created a vacuum that was quickly filled by civilian research groups, conspiracy theorists, and a growing subculture of ufologists. The official investigation was over, But the cultural phenomenon was just reaching its boiling point. Interestingly, the termination did not mean the sightings stopped. In fact, some of the most famous encounters in American history were yet to come. But from 1969 onward, the Air Force had a standard response for any inquiry. The Air Force does not conduct investigations of UFOs. This hands-off policy became a shield, allowing the military to avoid the swamp gas-style embarrassments of the past. The closing of Project Blue Book was not an admission that the mystery had been solved. It was an admission that the government was done trying to explain it to the public. As the final boxes were taped shut and moved into the shadows of the National Archives, a chapter of American history ended. The Blue Book was closed, but for those who had seen the unidentified 701, the questions remained as vivid and haunting as a glowing light in a midnight sky. For years after the 1969 closure of Project Blue Book, the American public was led to believe that the government's interest in flying saucers had vanished into the ether. The files were locked away, and the official stance was one of total indifference. However, the mid-1970s brought a seismic shift in American law and transparency. The strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. This legislative tool became the key that researchers and journalists used to pick the locks of the Pentagon's most guarded vaults, sparking the declassification era. Before FOIA, the Blue Book files were treated like ghost stories, vague, unreachable, and easily denied. But as the law began to force the hand of federal agencies, thousands of pages of memos, telegrams, and witness reports began to trickle into the public domain. What they revealed was a staggering disconnect between what the Air Force told the public and what they discussed behind closed doors. The declassified documents showed that while the military was publicly dismissing UFOs as weather balloons, they were privately tracking high-speed incursions over nuclear missile silos and scrambled jets to intercept craft that outturned anything in the U.S. inventory. The declassification process revealed the internal anxiety of the Cold War. Researchers discovered documents like the Bolender Memo, which explicitly stated that reports of UFOs which could affect national security were not part of the Blue Book system and would continue to be investigated even after Blue Book was shut down. This was a bombshell. It proved that the 1969 termination was, in many ways, a public relations shell game. The unimportant cases were closed, while the truly significant high-security cases were simply moved into even darker, black programs. As these files moved from the shadows to the National Archives, the scale of the phenomenon became clear. The public could finally read the raw testimonies of the unidentified 701. They saw the sketches drawn by panicked pilots and the frantic cables sent by radar operators. The declassification era transformed the UFO from a tabloid joke into a historical reality. It wasn't just about aliens. It was about a massive government apparatus that had spent decades managing public perception while struggling to understand a superior technology in its own skies. The most profound impact of the FOIA revelations was the birth of the modern disclosure movement. Organizations like the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, CAUS, used the law to sue the CIA and NSA for the release of their own hidden UFO files. These legal battles proved that the mystery didn't end at Wright-Patterson. It extended into the highest levels of the American intelligence community. Today, as we see a new wave of declassifications regarding UAPs, we are standing on the shoulders of those early FOIA pioneers. They proved that in a democracy, the truth cannot be kept under top secret stamps forever, and that the search for the unknowns is, at its heart, a search for government accountability. When Project Blue Book was terminated, the physical files were moved to the National Archives, but their psychic weight remained firmly lodged in the American imagination. The decades of secrecy, the grainy photographs of metallic discs, and the image of the man in the suit, debunking a terrified witness, didn't just stay in government vaults. They leaked into the very DNA of American pop culture. The Black Vault of Blue Book became the foundational myth for modern science fiction, transforming how we visualize the unknown. Before Blue Book, science fiction often portrayed aliens as monstrous invaders in the vein of the War of the Worlds. However, the Blue Book era introduced a new kind of aesthetic, the sleek, metallic flying saucer and the clandestine government cover-up. Hollywood realized that the most frightening thing wasn't just the visitor from another world. It was the fact that the government knew about it and wasn't telling you. This birthed a new subgenre of conspiracy sci-fi that remains a staple of American media today. The most direct cultural descendant of Project Blue Book is undoubtedly The X-Files. The character of Fox Mulder is essentially a modern-day reimagining of the true believer, investigators who were sidelined within the Air Force. The show's Smoking Man and its web of redacted documents and deep state secrets were pulled directly from the real-life frustrations of researchers like Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Even the iconic phrase, "the truth is out there," mirrors the sentiment of the thousands of witnesses who felt their experiences were buried under top-secret stamps in Ohio. Furthermore, Blue Book's scientific consultant, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, personally bridged the gap between military reality and Hollywood magic. He served as a technical advisor to Steven Spielberg for the 1977 masterpiece Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The film's title was taken directly from Hynek's own classification system, and Hynek himself even made a brief cameo in the movie's climax. This film marked a shift in culture, moving the UFO narrative away from Cold War fear and toward a sense of spiritual wonder and cosmic connection. The legacy of the Black Vault is also visible in the recurring trope of the secret hangar. From Independence Day to Indiana Jones, the idea that the U.S. government has a hidden warehouse, often referred to as Hangar 18, a direct nod to Wright-Patterson, where alien technology is stored, is an American cultural staple. It represents a deep-seated suspicion of authority that has defined the American psyche since the late 1960s. Ultimately, Project Blue Book did more than investigate lights in the sky. It created a new American folklore. It gave us a visual language for the extraterrestrial and a narrative framework for government secrecy. Long after the last file was declassified, the Black Vault continues to inspire writers, directors, and dreamers, ensuring that while the project may be officially dead, the mystery remains a vibrant, pulsing part of the American story. The closure of Project Blue Book in 1969 was meant to be the final word, a bureaucratic case closed on the UFO phenomenon. For decades, the official stance of the U.S. government was one of total disinterest. But the truth about the skies didn't stay buried in the National Archives. In the 21st century, the mystery has come roaring back, shedding the stigma of flying saucers, and evolving into a serious matter of national security known as unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP. The journey from the Cold War shadows of Blue Book to today's high-tech investigations represents an enduring American quest to understand the unknown. The silence was shattered in 2017, when the New York Times revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program called AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Led by intelligence officer Luis Elizondo, this program proved that the military had never truly stopped looking. Along with the report came the Pentagon UFO videos, infrared footage from Navy FA-18 Super Hornets showing craft like the Tic Tac, performing maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of gravity. Much like the 1952 Washington, D.C. flap, these sightings were backed by both pilot testimony and advanced radar data, making them impossible to dismiss as swamp gas. The political landscape has shifted dramatically since the days of Captain Ruppelt. Today, the conversation is no longer held in hushed tones in the corridors of Wright-Patterson. It has moved to the halls of Congress. In 2022, the Department of Defense established AARO, All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Unlike Blue Book, which often felt like a PR shield, AARO is mandated by law to provide transparent reports to Congress. We have moved from an era of national debunking to an era of official disclosure. Senators and representatives from both sides of the aisle are now demanding to know if these objects represent a great leap forward by a foreign adversary or something much more profound. The modern quest is driven by the same questions that haunted Dr. J. Allen Hynek, but with 21st century tools. We are no longer relying on blurry 16 film. We are using satellite imagery, multispectral sensors, and AI-driven data analysis. Yet the core of the mystery remains. Whether it is the unidentified 701 of 1969 or the transmedium craft of 2025, the phenomenon continues to operate at the edge of our scientific understanding, challenging our concepts of propulsion, space, and time. As we look beyond Blue Book, it is clear that the phenomenon has outlasted the Cold War, the space race, and the turn of the millennium. The quest for the truth is no longer just about aliens. It is a search for a deeper understanding of our place in the universe and the limits of our own technology. From the summer of the saucers to the latest AARO hearings, the American people remain fixated on the horizon. The book may have been closed in 1969, but the story is far from over. The truth is no longer just out there. It is being pulled piece by piece into the light of day.